Thank you very much. Thank you to Dr. Vermillion for the invitation. Before I came back to Kansas, I was at Western Michigan University and coordinated their graduate program in sport management. Western has about 28,000 students, so when I came back, when I went to Wichita's campus, and there was construction and no parking and no signs, and how do I get to the spot, I felt like I was back in Western Michigan. So I'm now at a college of less than 1,000 where you can park anywhere you want, and it's 2 minutes to the room, so I encourage you and support you as you try to find a parking spot every day. So I'm here because I spent February in Russia at Sochi, and I titled this presentation Russia's Olympics. There was no doubt in my mind that this was Olympics put on by Russia for Russians. And so I'm just going to highlight some of the things that I saw and then try to answer some of your questions. This was the process to end up in Sochi. Started about a year in advance, so in January 2013, they actually opened the online application process. They closed it at the end of February. So I completed that process and then heard nothing for almost 4 months. In April, got an invitation to do a Skype interview. So if you put the time together, it was about 3 in the morning to do a Skype interview. Skype interview included a lot of questions. It was about an hour long about what would you do if. A lot of scenarios. If you were walking across an open space because a supervisor called and said they needed you, yet you saw someone who needed help, would you stop and help them, or would you go to the site to which you'd been asked to go? A lot of what ifs, a lot of what would you do if someone got really angry at you? So after that interview, I realized they were very concerned about spectators getting really angry. So a lot of questions about how would you handle this. In May, there was an English proficiency test. This was online. This was for English speakers as well as non-English speakers. It had some interesting questions that were really hard to understand. So one of my biggest fears was that I had already indicated I was a college professor, that I was an English speaker, and that I would fail the English proficiency test. Very complicated, clearly written by someone who English was not their first language. Got over there and found out that probably 90% of the volunteers from Russia did not speak English. So I said to one of them, I thought you had to take an English proficiency test. And she said, oh, we just had somebody else do that for us. And I thought, yes, I can see that now. Didn't hear until August that I had been officially accepted to do this. Legal contract in September. Had to wait for a visa invitation letter to come from the government, and that came in December. And so about that time, I'm starting to get a little nervous about getting this visa processed in order to leave by February. Russia's a country that requires a visa to travel. The interesting thing about this visa was that it was a humanitarian visa. Russia would not issue a tourist visa for volunteers. You were told repeatedly that you were not allowed to tour, that this visa would not include any touring. We weren't allowed to be there more than 3 days in advance, and we had to be gone from at least 2 days, no later than 2 days afterwards. So that was an interesting, and no, I haven't heard an explanation for that, but there was not a lot of touring going on among volunteers. So as you probably know from the media, this was the center for the Winter Olympics, about the same climate as Athens, right on the Black Sea. You can see Moscow here, which is certainly further north. When most Kansans think of Russia, we think of Siberia, cold, but every day, I was placed in the mountains every day, mid-70s, sun, which was great for spectators, terrible for the conditions, as was previously mentioned. The media talked about Sochi, that Sochi was the site of these Olympics. Sochi is actually a series of cities that run along the Black Sea. So it wasn't just Sochi. To get from Olympic Park to Sochi is about a 45-minute train ride. So you had Sochi City, in which there were no Olympic activities that happened in Sochi City. Adler, which is the next place, and a lot of volunteers lived there. A lot of people stayed there when they came. Olympic Village, where most of the coastal cluster athletes lived. Olympic Park, again, this is on a train, the very bottom of Sochi. As I'll show you here in a minute, all the indoor events happened at Olympic Park. The star that you're seeing there is where most of the volunteers lived. I lived where the star is, and if you know anything about Russia's history or current terrorist problems, we were probably about 6 miles away from the Russia-Georgia border, high kidnap zone, a lot of terrorist activities, and not in the best part of town. This is the mountain cluster here, and what you can see is that the mountain cluster is a train ride. It's like living in Denver and taking the train to a ski resort every morning. So it's about a 3-hour commute for volunteers to go from where we lived to the mountain cluster. This is the coastal cluster, all the indoor things. You can see that this was right on the Black Sea, but anything indoors was at the coastal cluster. And I wanted to just highlight this little piece here, which is kind of an interesting thing that you only notice if you're looking for it. That is actually a cemetery that they were not allowed to move when they tore down everything else. So I know it's a little hard to see with the lighting in here, but it's a cemetery in the middle of Olympic Park. And as you went into Olympic Park, you really couldn't tell until you peered through the trees. The mountain cluster, again, about 3 hours away from Olympic Park by train and bus. I was positioned at the Laura Cross Country and Biathlon Center, which was the highest of all the mountain clusters, but all the other mountain events were in the mountains there. As we came down each night, if we had the late shift, came down from the Laura Biathlon Center, you could see all the other sites lit up, which was a really fantastic thing to see the sliding and the alpine and the snowboard. When I was assigned to the Cross Country Biathlon Center, my first thought was, really? How about ice skating or, ice hockey or something really exciting? What I learned was that in Russia, this was the premier spot. Russians love the biathlon. They love cross country. And it turned out that a lot of folks were positioned there because this was such a high attended event. Everyone wore verification, both workers as well as spectators. A little taste of Russia, it took 4 photo submissions to get one that was appropriately somber and that was accepted for this little neck piece. What this shows you is that I was working at the cross-country biathlon venue. I was allowed in Olympic Park and on public transportation. So that was scanned every time you went through security and had to be worn all the time. This was the uniform that we got, and it is bright aqua blue with patchwork. I could be wearing it next time I ski in Colorado, but probably won't. It was kind of the epitome of the opposite of what people thought of Russia, and I'm sure it was intentional to have something bright and happy. So the folks who worked in the mountains had a slightly different uniform than people who worked at the coast. We had insulated pants and 3 layers of jackets and a bunch of hats and gloves and boots. People who worked in the coastal cluster had a lighter weight because it was 80 degrees down there. This is one of the Olympic volunteer housing centers. Olympic volunteers lived in these kind of houses. There were high rises that were built just to handle the volunteers, which were then going to be turned into housing for the poor afterwards. These looked as if, at one point, someone just said to all the workers, stop, whatever you're doing, leave. They weren't finished, they weren't ready, we were there anyway. You can see the little box every day. You'd go through security to get in. You'd show your ID. Little square of my housing. This was the first Olympics in which volunteers were given free housing. So this was an unusual piece. We didn't pay for housing. The Olympics provided that for us. I lived in a room with 4 people, so 3 others. But there were some male volunteers who lived in a room with 10. So imagine a high rise. A room really tiny, probably about the size of the restroom that I was in here, bunk beds, windows that were locked closed, and 10 men. I know you can smell it already. So it was an interesting piece as far as housing. These were laundry facilities. So 2 weeks, no machines, nothing, just a nice tub and some drying racks. From an organizational point of view, this is Command Central at the volunteer housing center where I live that had 3,000 volunteers. What you're seeing here is a box. That's the filing system. What you're seeing here are piles and piles of copies of passports and travel documents and visas. This is, although there were a couple computers that they were starting to enter things in, it really was pretty basic when it came to coordinating of this. And so you can imagine 3,000 volunteers showing up waiting in a line that just circled around this whole complex as they checked you in and gave you credentials. The interesting piece, their interpretation of security was 1 key per room. Then they can control where the keys were. So imagine a room of 10 guys with 1 key. So anytime you left, you dropped the key off with the key man, and then as you came back, you had to see if your key was there, or if one of your friends happened by chance to put it in his or her pocket and take it up to the mountain cluster, you had to sit around and wait for them. So it was an interesting process. Again, he's in Command Central, which is a tiny little room. This is a dining hall, kind of like a MASH tent. So the 3 major volunteer centers had a kind of a tent for dining hall. And this is where you really do need better lighting to fully appreciate the food that's up here. These are 2 of the breakfast menus. This was one breakfast, another breakfast, kind of crepes filled with some strange things. I think it was what was other left from the other day. Sometimes you'd have really big hot dogs. Evening, it was pretty much a plate in which they just scooped things out in a ladle. And it was interesting because they would scoop it out and put it on the plate, and then they'd put it on the scale. If it weighed too much, they'd take some off, and if it weighed too little, they'd put a little bit more on. And the thing that became really obvious quickly was that the international volunteers, like me, who were older and from the West, complained an awful lot. Russians, not a disparaging word about anything. Nothing. Not about housing, not about food. They ate everything, and you could always tell where the internationals were sitting, because we were like, oh my gosh, what is this? Or, oh my gosh, it's so terrible. So it was interesting that we quickly saw that about ourselves and learned to kind of reset what normal was and to just be a little more appreciative. Everything you heard in the media about the dogs was true, although there were more dogs than the media said there were. These are some of the dogs that were near our place. Cute. They weren't that interested in people. Media didn't cover the fact there were also horses walking around these places of living, but now you get to see that. They knew there were international volunteers, but every sign in the volunteer center was in Russian. So plastered over everything were Russian signs. No idea what they said. One day there's this sign on the door, and we all think, this looks important, but I have no idea what the problem is. Turns out that after we asked a few people, this guy had found a volunteer uniform and was breaking into rooms and stealing things. But this lack of understanding the language clearly humbled you, and you realized that not everyone does speak English, and there wasn't that intent. This is the neighborhood in which volunteers lived. Very poor, very few places to buy groceries, very few people driving cars. What happened around Sochi was that anything that was semi-undesirable from a visual point of view had a fence put up in front of it. So the only reason I could actually see the neighborhood is because I walked to the grocery store. But fences up everywhere. So if you were not in a bus, which the volunteers were, if you were in a car, you couldn't really see the neighborhood. Anything that was kind of questionable had these big Sochi signs put up in front of it. So there's a lot of hiding of the neighborhood for visitors. The media reported that Sochi was not ready for the Olympics. Sochi was not ready for the Olympics. There were big, massive construction projects that weren't finished. This is a big housing thing to handle volunteers, to handle people who came to visit, still under construction, not completed. In the mountain cluster, you'd have these huge hotels that were maybe at a 10th capacity. Weren't completed yet, weren't ready. They had staff there, but only about a few rooms were open. When you come back at night, you'd see just a huge spot of blackness, and then a little corner of the hotel, you'd see the lights on where the rooms where people were in. I took this picture because they were still doing building while we were there, so one day we went to the mountains, we came back and there's a sidewalk laid. Next day we came back, there are trees planted. So even while we were there, they were still under construction. This is day 8 of the Olympics, and they're still putting up signs. So the issue of, in America, we judge how well you do something by how efficient you are and are you ready. I think Russia was ready for the events. They had those event centers ready, not quite as ready for having spectators and volunteers and visitors come. The funny thing was that the Russian volunteers who were on my team were confused as to why I was taking this picture. I said, I'm taking the picture because he's still setting up, and it's day 8. What is so special about that? That didn't, all the international volunteers, they understood the concept, so we were still working on that. I just took this picture related to readiness because there were a lot of questions about how ready they'd be for the Paralympics. I haven't been in a wheelchair, but I'm guessing this is going to be a really difficult ride. This is one example of Sochi in the city being ready for the Paralympics. So, yeah, a little scary. I haven't read too much about how they did, but I'm sure that our colleague here can probably speak to some of that. The media, as you know, before the Olympics was very successful in convincing people not to go to the Olympics because of security fears. It was visible, security was visible in and around Sochi. There were armed security folks who clearly, this was their job, but a lot of security was handled by teenagers and 20-year-olds in purple uniforms that basically they just hired as volunteers. But on the train, you saw armed security folks. People who came to the events had to have a spectator pass as well as a ticket. So this was an interesting challenge because that was not communicated well to the Russians. So what happened is, for the first couple days, Russians would show up at the event with their ticket, but with no spectator pass, and they'd be turned away. And for the first 3 days of the Olympics, a lot of volunteers were spent sitting in the seats so that as this was covered in the media, there weren't a whole lot of empty seats in the grounds. So a spectator pass plus the tickets. These are people waiting in line for this for hours and hours. They'd wait in line for the spectator pass. They'd wait in line for the tickets. This is a culture that really doesn't seem to mind waiting in line. A couple pictures here related to security. If you can see here on the bus, these little tapes that are here on every spot where the bus can open. When a bus would leave any secure area like downtown Sochi or Olympic Park and it would drive to the mountains, once it was checked, sniffed by dogs, ran the mirrors underneath, then they would tape it shut. This said, when I got to the mountain cluster, this is a safe and secure and a clean van. Then, when they opened the doors, that tape would break, and now we knew that it had been breached, and that was okay if they were letting people out. I saw a bus stop once where I was working at a security stop. They had to take everyone out because the tape had come off, and it said that it was unsecure, and so they had to go back and have it rechecked. So they were paying attention to security. This is a little ground-to-air missile, which you saw a lot of around the mountain cluster. So there were visible security on each of the mountain sites. Some aerial surveillance that was happening. This happens to be on the ground at the moment. This was usually in the air. The workforce, as we ended up actually riding a train that came up from the coast, ended up somewhere around here, then ended up walking about 1.5 miles to the bottom of the gondola site, took a gondola then up into the mountain, then had to take chairlifts to get up to a higher site. What you're seeing here is the Biathlon Center. One of the international volunteers, who was also older, most international volunteers were 40 to 50-year-olds, had a pedometer and said that he worked at my site, the lowest we walked was a 3-mile day, and the highest we walked on a training day was nearly 10, that we averaged 6 miles of walking every day. So this clearly affected the older international volunteers more than the young folks. These are some interesting demographics because this set Sochi apart, not in the number of applications. They estimated it was around 200,000. They selected about 25,000. 5 just came to the Paralympics, but 20,000 then kind of did a little bit of both. But the average age, 23. This is younger than any of the other previous Olympics, which averaged anywhere from 35 to 40. 70% of volunteers were under 25. 5% older than 50. So I'm in one of those categories. You can probably figure out which one. 70% female. So this was a young female volunteer group. Probably the estimate was probably less than 50 Americans and only about 5% international volunteers total. So the international volunteer presence was very low at Sochi, and so this was an interesting dynamic. This is the one time in which international volunteers were actually trained in English, so that you can see there are about 15 of us here that were at our site where they were doing some training. These folks, there's one other American in this group, but the rest are from different English-speaking countries. This is part of my work team. As you can see, average age, probably 20. This is Pavel. He's my team leader. He was 21, never led a thing in his life. I mean, it's self-reported. It's not like I guessed that, although I probably could have guessed that. So I said, how did you get this job? He said, I don't know. They just asked me like 2 weeks ago. Really? Yeah, they said, how much English do you speak? And he said, oh, I speak a little bit. And they said, great, you're a team leader. So Pavel had no idea what was going on because he just didn't know. The interesting thing about this kind of group is that I'm a college professor, so most of the time I just felt like I was right at home. It was mostly texting and Facebooking and hanging out with friends and doing selfies, and I just thought, I just feel like I'm back at my work. The interesting part about this is that I didn't see a single person making a decision that was older than probably 22. I'm sure they were there somewhere, but I didn't see them. So you had young people leading young people, leading young people, and it's not that it's the young people issue, as you know. It's not about you being young, it's about they had no idea because they'd never done anything before. So this was a Olympics led by youth. This is Olympic Park. Just a couple interesting things here. This yellow is where the spectators came in. Gold is where the workers came in. And here, we talked a little bit about Dr. Dittmore talked a little bit about sponsorship. The green arrow is where the corporate sponsor tents were, completely removed from Olympic Park. So if you wanted to look at them, you had to do that before you entered into Olympic Park, and they're very far away from all of it. This is the only recognition I saw of the Olympic partners. One fence sheet that identified who they were. There were no McDonald's on site in Olympic Park. There were some Coca-Cola tents, and you could find Coca-Cola there, but it was really hard to find these corporate sponsors. The only one that managed to land a coup here was Bosco. Bosco is a brand of apparel and sports wear that built all the volunteer uniforms, all the security uniforms, and they had a presence in the Olympic Park, but no one else did. The Olympic Park, I'll just mention this here so you can see this over. This is the Ice Hockey Center, and this is the NBC studio. Because they were a corporate sponsor, they had their studio right there that today's show was broadcast from there. Every venue had its own Olympic rings. The thing I wanted to point out about Olympic Park is this is not early in the morning. This is the middle of the afternoon, and Olympic Park is empty. I didn't have to fight anybody to take this picture. This is Olympic Park during the Olympics in the middle of the afternoon on a competition day. No one. This is an hour before competition events start. No one. There was nothing to do in Olympic Park, and no one was there until they came for the event. And so what happened is that from a sport management point of view, there was no one selling anything, no vendors, no capitalist kind of money-making entrepreneurship. People who were mostly Russian came for the event, and then they left. So it was interesting, volunteers would say, well, what are we going to do? We've got a little free time. Do you want to go to Olympic Park? And you'd say, no. What's there to do in Olympic Park? There's nothing to do in Olympic Park. This is one of 2 eating places in Olympic Park. 2, and this, again, was about 2 hours before events. You just saw very few people eating there. So, it wasn't the Russian mentality was not, let's go hang out at Olympic Park and watch some really great athletes. It was, let's get there, see our event, and then we'll go. These are folks coming to an event. Over the piece, you can see the nice weather, short sleeve shirts, but you can also see the distance to the mountain venues. Had an opportunity to see both ice hockey and curling in an indoor sport. These are the stands at ice hockey, and this is 10 minutes before the start of the event. Slovenia versus Austria. So here's one of the things that they found is that Olympic spectators, Russian spectators, which made up probably about 95% of the spectators, really weren't that interested in seeing anyone compete other than Russians. So oftentimes what would happen at these indoor events, especially for television's sake, is that they would use volunteers to fill the stands. Now if you remember the crazy jacket we had on, they'd have them turn them inside out so they didn't look like volunteers. So sometimes you talk to someone, what'd you do today? Oh, I was a seat filler at ice skating. Really? All day? Yep. For 6 hours I sat there. This is just an interesting cultural difference. I took this picture. This is the Biathlon Center. This is a wave of people leaving the event, but the event's not over, but Russia is out of medal contention. So you think about trying to fill the stands. These Russians came to watch Russians, but as soon as the Russians weren't going to get a medal, they all left. So it's just a different approach to, going to the Olympics. This is the company that made the most money at the Olympics, and probably the only corporate sponsor who really benefited. Bosco, they had a store in Olympic Park. It was the only place to buy Olympic paraphernalia. The only place. And people would wait in line 6-7 hours to get in. And what they would do is they'd let in like 10 people, and then they'd wait for 10 to get out. And they'd let in 10 more. You could, if you took the train up to Sochi, find a tiny little vendor selling teeny tiny little trinkets, but that was it. So all the people who said to me, hey, bring me back a t-shirt, got nothing. Because not only was I not going to wait for 7 hours in the Bosco line, although I did get in there after the Olympics were over in an intermediate day, they were so expensive. Imagine no competition for a jacket. Just amazing, the difference. I just thought how American I was. I kept thinking, where are the stands? Where are the kids, selling t-shirts around the corner? Just a couple other things about Olympic Park. Most countries have houses in which you can go and see, learn about the country, eat some food. This is the Canada House in which you could go in, drink a few different types of Canadian beverages. And here's the U.S. House beside it. It is tiny. The U.S. House was referred to by everyone as the fort. This is the back side of the U.S. House. You couldn't get into the U.S. House unless you had a U.S. passport. So heavily secured, very concerned about going in. And really the only thing you could do there was you could shop at the front, probably about a fourth of it, where it was a Ralph Lauren store. So if you wanted to pay $900 for that patchwork sweater that the athletes wore, you could do that. And then the rest was just for athletes and media. So there really wasn't an America House for other folks to come see. In Olympic Park, obviously one of the big things is the medal ceremony, and you get to see some medals here today from our colleague. But I was able to get to the front of this because a friend of mine who was a volunteer, her friend was the French announcer for the awards ceremony, so she got us right in up to the athlete spot. This is Erin, Hamlin, luge, bronze in the luge. Clearly the star of the show is not me, but the flame. Great part of the Olympic Park, but again, this is the middle of the day on a day I had off, and I didn't have to kick anybody out of the way to get that picture with just me. If you've been around the Olympic flame, some of you I know have been to the Olympics, this sounds like 600 hot air balloons going off ahead of you, over your head. It's just got that hissing sound that you associate with balloons going by. Just wanted to finish up here. This again is the ice hockey piece. I did have a chance to go to the Today Show and watch that taping. That was fun. On that day, Scott Hamilton was there. It was right after the ice skaters, and they had all the big controversy about ice skating. And so the ice skaters were there talking about the gold. Got to see Matt Lauer and Al Roker and all those folks. But that was just kind of a brief overview of my experience. I'd like to, if you have any questions, be happy to answer them, but just want to give you kind of insight into the volunteer piece from Sochi. So thank you. Anything I can answer for you? Yes. Yeah, great question. Most of the time, I did this. And sometimes I just did this. It was an interesting and probably, when people ask me what was the best part and the worst part, I think probably the most frustrating part was not being able to contribute. And it was interesting, it wasn't just me, but I saw a lot of folks who had really specific skills, like a guy who was a high-level speed skater, but he was an American, applied to be at the speed skating center, and they didn't use him. So most of the time he just gave directions, put coats in security baskets, told people where the restrooms were. So I think it was a little bit of the fact that I didn't speak Russian, but then you would meet people who spoke Russian and English, who were older international volunteers, and they hadn't even used them. So I kept thinking, boy, those are perfect people to be in those moments where you have to make decisions, but even those folks were mostly just giving directions and smiling and saying, yeah, thanks for coming. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that I get asked that question. I haven't asked that question, and the answer to that is I don't think so. I don't know. It was a great thing to have done, and I'm glad I did it. I think the experience would be different some other place, and so it's hard for me to, this was my only experience. I did have a chance to see and talk with a lot of folks who'd volunteered at London or Vancouver or some at Salt Lake, and so to hear them talk about the differences made me think that maybe I should go try it some other place. I don't know. If I do, I'm going to be in better shape and carry food with me. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Oh, yeah.
Are you aware of any requirements that the IOC has as far as percentage of volunteers that are needed for, like, you said there's a very small percentage of international volunteers.
Yeah, 5%.
Do they have to have international volunteers if they're bid, or?
I'm not aware of that. What is really clear is that the host country pretty much handles all the volunteer things. So the host country is responsible for the volunteers. They coordinate that. I think I'm sure there are central IOC people who kind of supervise that, but I'm guessing that it's pretty much up to the host country. One of the interesting things that happened is that as I was talking to some folks from Great Britain, is that they knew several people who had been called after they had been given the letter that they could go and said, we don't need you anymore. And the question was, well, why is that? Well, because the housing that we thought was going to be ready is not ready. So actually the rumor was from, in these places it's a lot of informal learning. So this volunteer talked with this coach who was that about 1,500 international volunteers were told they couldn't come because they had no housing for them. And as a result, what they ended up doing was recruiting people from the community because they needed more help, but they didn't have a place for them to live, so they lived at home and just kind of came in. Yeah. That doesn't surprise me that it wasn't ready, but yeah, I don't know if there's any requirement.
I have one other question. The ramp on the stairs, was that the ski slope?
It could have been.
Okay.
And as we were fun, I think you're.
A little different than most people.
Yeah. The interesting thing for us, because the Paralympics there's a 8-day gap between the two, to see what they were calling, accessibility, and a lot of it was, I just couldn't imagine moving a wheelchair through 4 inches of snow and on really steep incline. So it'll be interesting. I would be very interested and have not yet taken the time to read what people have said about that. But I will tell you that in our international training, all English, when they were speaking in English, the lady who was training us said, I feel really bad saying this to you, but I've never seen anyone in a wheelchair. And one of the international volunteers says, why is that? She said, well, in Russia, because we're not accessible, anyone in a wheelchair just stays home. She said, we don't know what Russia's going to do when people in wheelchairs, people who can't see, who can't hear, who have any kind of difference, we've never seen them before. So, yeah, I'm sure it was a challenge for them too. All right, well, thank you very much. Or in Russia, they would say spasiba.